Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rick Gosen. I'm chair of the ELO network. Today we've got another great presenter, Phil Cooke, who will be speaking on the secrets of becoming a creative leader. All right, I'll just introduce Phil and then we'll get rolling. So most importantly, Phil is a friend and supporter of ELO. He has been a speaker at the Vancouver event and the Winnipeg event, and this year will be one of our presenters in Toronto. Which will be great. And also Phil's wife, Kathleen, is a great presenter, speaker in her own right. And she also has spoken at the previous forums and will be speaking in Toronto also. So we're really looking forward to that. So thanks for being a supporter of ELO. So Phil,
Hey, I'm honored to be here. I love what you guys are doing, and I love your vision for leadership and the impact you're making with this generation of leaders. So count me in every time you do a project.
well, we appreciate that. And Phil is based down used to be in the Los Angeles area, now in Nashville. Phil is a strategic advisor to church, nonprofit, and media leaders navigating crisis credibility and cultural influence in a rapidly changing digital world. Founder of Cooke Media Group, he has worked with senior leadership teams globally to strengthen reputation and clarify mission. He is the author of many books, including Church on Trial and Maximize Your Influence. So after we finish the webinar, of course, we'll have the recording that people can access, but definitely go to just Google Phil Cooke. You'll find his website. You'll find all the great books that he's written. And in this session, we'll focus on how leaders can develop the skills to motivate creative teams. So the title of this session, so thanks a lot, Phil, for being here.
Sure.
We're going to jump right into the questions. We like to, chop,
Absolutely.
get right to it and provide some clear takeaways for everybody who's listening. So the title was The Secrets of Becoming a Creative Leader. So why don't you first talk about what's a creative leader? And then secondly, what are the secrets about?
Well, it's interesting. I noticed, Rick, that there's a ton of leadership information out there. My friend John Maxwell, so many others are great at teaching leadership, but there's very little out there on how to lead creative people. And we live in a creative economy these days. We live in a world that's being overwhelmed with information. If we're trying to get a message out there, sell a product, sell a service, whatever we do, it's getting more and more difficult because we're simply being overwhelmed. In fact, one British survey indicates that the average person today sees about 10,000 media messages every single day. So how in the world do we cut through that? And I think it's going to be creativity. We've constantly got to come up with new and innovative ways to get our message out there. So I think a creative leader is someone who's not only a great leader, but they particularly know how to inspire, motivate creative teams, whether it's graphic designers, video people, website people, because that's going to be the leading edge, I think, of business in the future.
So often people will say, like, it's this classic thing of, well, I'm not creative. So address this issue of,
Yes.
am I born creative or can I become creative?
Well, it's interesting. I wrote a book called Ideas on a Deadline, How to Be Creative Under Pressure. And when I wrote that book, I discovered research that indicates everybody is born creative. There's nobody, often when I'll speak at conferences and events, somebody will come up to me and say, Phil, that's great, but I'm not a creative person. I just have never been creative. That isn't true. There's nobody. Look at a bunch of little kids. They're all wildly creative. The fact is, creativity is a muscle, and we've learned there's some research that indicates we start losing it about the time we go to school, about six or 7 years old, which, first of all, that says something about our education system, that when we start school, we start getting less and less creative. But it's really true that we're all born creative, and it's like a muscle. If you don't use it, you start to lose it. So I always encourage people, look, no matter where you are in life, no matter where you are as a leader, you can amp up your creativity. Drive to work in a different route, wear different clothes, talk to different people, read different books. Just start looking at life in a different way, and it'll start to spark creative ideas that maybe you've never had before.
So would you say in an odd way that leaders get the creativity that they deserve? In other words, that a leader can actually foster, facilitate, encourage creativity.
That's right. Or they can't, or they make a decision not to. But it's really, really true that leaders determine the future. And, I think it goes without saying to everyone watching or listening today that, culture is more important than vision. I've consulted and advised companies that were The leaders had amazing vision, but the culture was so dark. It was oppressive. People didn't trust each other. People didn't like each other. They didn't work together well. And I've been in other situations where the leader didn't have a particularly astounding vision, but let me tell you, it was a vibrant, creative culture in that organization, and something I can guarantee you is going to come out of that. So you're exactly right. I think the key is, what is the culture of your organization like? And if it's open to creativity and innovation, things are going to happen.
So that's quite interesting that you tie culture into creativity, because if we look, so maybe you explain this, but if I think of the creative process, I think of people spinning off lots of ideas, a lot of which maybe, like I always think of like a skit writer for a Saturday Night Live. They
Yes.
might have 100 bad ideas and one good one,
Yes.
but people have to be open to realizing, okay, 99%, 90% of your ideas may be bad. But if you're in a culture where people aren't feeling free to just throw things out there, and if they're subject to ridicule or
Yes.
by their peers, it's obviously not going to work. So just talk about
Yeah.
how you foster that creative culture.
Excessive criticism is a real problem with a lot of companies. It's so funny that most employees, they're not the ones that come up with ideas. There's a creative core of people in most companies that come up with ideas. But it's interesting that once somebody voices a new idea, everybody feels free to criticize it. Everybody wants to jump on board and tell you what's wrong with it. So I think number one, you have to think about your culture at your company, about how let me see how to put it. You don't want to have a spirit of excessive criticism. You have to be very, very careful, because I've learned that shooting down an idea too early is going to force that guy, that person that came up with the idea, is going to hold back next time. And his next idea could be the one that saves the company. So I think we need to create, as leaders, we have to create an atmosphere where people are not afraid to fail. Now, let me say this. I don't create a cult of failure in my company. I tell my people, look, you can fail once, but after that, on this particular idea, we've got to learn from that and grow.
Yeah, after that,
So,
you're actually failing somewhere else.
exactly. You're failing at this job. So we have to be careful. But I do think that excessive criticism is a big problem. Everybody's a critic these days. I think social media has kind of trained people that way. And we just have to be very careful of that, because one thing I've learned is ideas are the most fragile things in the world. I've learned over the years that if you don't write them down, if you don't protect them, if you don't nurture them, you'll forget them. And I met one guy that had an idea, a wild idea back in the day of flip phones. Remember flip phones? He had an idea sitting in the shopping mall watching teenagers use their phone, that what if they could download their favorite songs and use those as ringtones on their phone? And nobody had ever done that before. And he told me that he had a pen in his pocket. He didn't have a paper, so he found a brochure at the mall. He was at a mall sitting on a bench, and he wrote down the idea, put it in his pocket right as someone yelled at him to come and meet them at a restaurant. He said he totally forgot about the idea. 6 months later, put on that jacket, reached into his pocket, pulled it out, remembered that night at the mall, and he said, I've got to do this. So he started with 5 songs. He bought the right to 5 songs, made a deal with a local cell phone company. And 2 years later, he sold that company for nearly $100 million. And what was interesting was he said, Phil, it's not the $100 million. It's the fact that had I not written that idea down, I would have completely forgotten about it. So I learned ideas are fragile and we need to be careful. Write them down. You just never know when you're going to just completely forget a great idea.
Well, is another component of the creative process humility? So what I mean by that is there's all these legendary stories where ideas for companies actually came from either employees on the front line or from customers. So apparently, I don't know if it's Big Mac, if McDonald's is an example, but I think so many things that McDonald's is well known for weren't part of the original McDonald's. And there's all
Yeah.
these companies. So maybe just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, remember that the Nike logo, the swoosh logo, was created by a graphic designer that I think they paid her $35 to do it. And it's become one of the most globally recognized logos in the history of the world. So, yeah, you never know who's going to have that next great idea. I was on a commercial TV shoot one time. I was doing a TV commercial, big national commercial, and it was telling the story of a guy who grew up in the 50s stealing hubcaps for a living. And he went on to build a great business. And I had a scene that I finished the commercial at Christmas time, and people were handing out gifts, and they gave him, as the founder is now an old guy, they gave him a gift, and I could not figure out what gift that should be. And my writer couldn't figure it out. My producer couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. And suddenly an assistant to the assistant of the makeup artist, she came forward and said, What if it's a hubcap? What if it's a hubcap? And boom, that was the idea. And it worked. It was hilarious. It ended the spot and it ended up being super successful. So it taught me a valuable lesson that you just never know where the next big idea will come from. So humility is a really big part of that.
So one of the things we discussed earlier is looking at critical skills that will help foster a culture to attract and inspire creative men and women to
Yeah.
accomplish great things. So of course, for any company to succeed, you need the talent, you need the good people. So just in terms of takeaways, can you just rattle off a
Sure.
number of the critical skills that people listening in should have to build that culture?
Great question. I think number one, learn to balance challenge and stability. You know, creative people want to be challenged. At the same time, they need to have a sense of stability. You don't inspire a creative person by saying, "Look, if your logo doesn't work, we're going out of business." You don't inspire them by saying, "If this video isn't good, you're fired." That doesn't inspire creative people. They need a certain amount of stability in their life to be able to unleash amazing ideas. Do you want them worried about their job or worried about their circumstances, or do you want them to start focusing on creating amazing things? So learn to challenge your creative people, but at the same time, don't threaten them. I think that stability really, really does matter. Another big thing is make sure all your leaders are on the same page when you assign a creative project. I got a call one time from a pastor. This church had called and asked me if we would do a video celebrating a big anniversary event they were doing at this historic church. And the pastor called me and we talked for about an hour. He downloaded his ideas about what that video should be about, and it was fantastic. Well, an hour later, guess what? His executive pastor called me and said, "Well, Phil, what the pastor said really isn't what we need. Let me explain what we need." And he went through an hour. And guess what? The next morning, I got a call from the music director at the church. And he had a whole nother idea about what it should be. And an hour later, a call from, I think it was the worship pastor. The bottom line is, within 48 hours, I got calls from 4 different leaders at that church about what that assignment should be. Total confusion, totally contradictory. So before you assign a graphic designer a project, a video person, a web person, whatever, make sure all your leaders are on the same page so you're echoing the same goals and the same purpose. Another big thing that is maybe the most important is understand the difference between organizational structure and communication structure. You know, organizational structure is important for every company. Who reports to who, what department is where, those things matter. But when it comes to communication, things should be much more free flowing. For instance, I dealt with a company one time that was rebranding, and they had a terrific graphic designer, and they were having her design a new logo. The problem was she had to get that logo approved by her boss. Then he had to get it approved by his boss, who had to get it approved by his boss, and then got it approved by his boss before it ever got to the CEO, who would make the final decision. Well, number one, it took 9 months for all that to happen. And number two, by the time it got to the CEO, it was not even close to what that original graphic designer had created. It was a monstrosity. So understand that when it comes to creative and communication issues, whoever's creating that thing needs to go to whoever is going to do the final sign off. They need to get information from him or her. They need to get approvals from him or her. Don't make them wade through the whole organizational structure to do it. And I would say one more thing that's really, really critical is, John Maxwell made famous the line, "Walk the factory floor." As a leader, you need to get to know your people as much as possible. I know some of you guys have hundreds of employees, even thousands of employees. You can't know everybody, but as much as possible, you want to walk the factory floor. Well, one of the great examples I use is Ed Catmull, who's the CEO of Pixar Entertainment. He recently retired, but he's the founding CEO of Pixar Entertainment. It became the CEO as well of Disney Animation. One of the things he does that just really blew me away is whenever they do a blockbuster film like Toy Story, in fact, this month they're releasing Toy Story 5. That's how successful that series is. Each of the animators that works on the film gets a bonus if it hits a certain target. Well, guess what? They may have 160 animators on a typical film. And it would be easy with technology to drop that bonus in there, direct deposit them into their bank account. Just so easy to do it. You know what Ed does? Ed has a check cut for every single person individually. Then he makes an appointment with each person to go to their office or
Hmm.
have them come to his office. He meets with them. He tells them how appreciative it is, how much they contributed to the project, how valuable they are, and he personally hands them that bonus check. Let me tell you, those employees will walk through fire for Ed Catmull. And we wonder why Pixar is such a blockbuster company, why they've made so much money, why they're so incredibly successful. That's one of the keys. So, valuing your creative team, developing that personal relationship with them, I'm going to tell you, it can change the direction of your company.
Mhm. So when you look at attracting creative people, I mean, obviously they can be big difference makers in an organization. Sometimes and companies will look for the person who already is at that level.
Yeah.
It's like in a sports team. You get the person who's the established star, or how do you determine who might be the star who then can stick with your company? So
Yes.
what would be some ways of identifying, let's say, talent in the organization where people maybe they're in their 20s or 30s who've got really the potential to grow into leaders within the organization?
Well, that's a great question. And a great way to do it is look for people that think differently. Look for that person that kind of pushes back every once in a while with a lot of decisions and a lot of things, not because he's trying to be a jerk, just because he has another idea. I worked with a company one time that had a graphic designer who was brilliant, brilliant, but he was a little weird. He had a mohawk haircut, he had tattoos everywhere. The other employees really didn't like working with him. In fact, they put together a combined letter asking the CEO to fire this kid. And the CEO asked me, what should I do? And I said, look, let's put him in a different building for a while. Let's give it a few months and see what happens. We got him out of everybody's sight, let him do his thing, gave him freedom. He loved working from, midnight till 8 in the morning. He just loved late night working sessions.
Mhm.
Well, within a matter of months, he'd completely transformed the look of that television station he worked with. The advertising, the branding, everything had been completely transformed because that CEO was willing to give him a little space. So look for the people who are not necessarily renegades because they're jerks, but they think differently, and really focus on those people. And if possible, pair them up with somebody who's more experienced as a creative, maybe an older graphic designer, an older video person, web person, somebody who can help them grow as a creative person. So, yeah, that's a great idea. Really starting to intentionally develop the younger creative teams, the younger creative people in your company or your nonprofit or wherever you are. I think that's absolutely critical.
So one thing that I just thought of as you're giving that answer, because I've seen this with clients, and it's an interesting issue. So let's say you've got an organization with 100 plus employees, and you've got a marketing team, and the from what you described about creativity and the creative process, it doesn't fit into, say, some normal boxes. So when you do your organizational structure and set your guidelines for the company. So if you have somebody who looks different, acts different, and like you say, maybe shows up at 8 at night, leaves at 3 in the morning,
Yeah.
but the next day doesn't show up at 8 a.m., but shows up at just in time for lunch. And
Yep.
and then people look askance at that and think, well, this person's not carrying their weight or they're not abiding by the company policy. But it might be that marketing department where from the way you like, for example, the creativity
Yeah.
comes from unstructured habits, free flow. Creativity strikes at a certain time. So, what would you say to companies to go, okay, maybe there has to be some allowance or,
Yes.
like that they're sort of different,
Yeah.
animals over there that we just can't treat the same way we can maybe the finance person.
Well, I don't let the creative team run the show. I don't give them so much, rope that they hang themselves.
Right.
They have to be a part of the team. But here's the thing: I'm willing to give them space, but I'm not willing to cut anything away from their results. They've got to produce.
Right.
With my team, I don't care when they work, how they work, what they do at work, whether they work at home, whether they work in the company. I don't care, but I do care about results. And I want to see, it's part of the reason our production company, Cooke Media Group, we've never gone over budget in a project. We've always delivered. We have walls and walls and walls full of awards that we've won over the years, largely because even though I give my creative people space, I also absolutely demand that we get results. So I think that that's a big part of it. And that's what balances it all. As long as they're
Yeah.
delivering results, as long as they're doing amazing creative work, then I'm willing to give them more and more freedom and more space
Yeah.
if that's what it takes.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, believe it or not, we only have 5 minutes left for the webinar. So I just want to ask some general questions.
Sure.
So one question, you've been involved in so many great projects over the years and a lot of high profile organizations. So maybe just talk about, a couple of your projects where we might know the name of the organization and what you did for them and just how the process went when you're working with some of these big groups?
Over the years, we've done about everything in the world. We've done Super Bowl commercials, we've done television events and specials and things like that. But what I really focus on is helping churches and nonprofit organizations especially tell their story in this media driven distracted culture that we live in. The Museum of the Bible that just opened up a few years ago in Washington D.C., we did all the media for the leading up to the launch of that museum. For instance, we had a film team on site every month for 3.5 years documenting the construction, the archive, everything they do. And so it's an interesting thing. We just feel like nonprofit organizations, Christian organizations in particular, are doing remarkable work around the world, and
It's
very
really
few are
cool.
helping them tell that story in the media, especially.
Right.
So we've done some remarkable work with from the Salvation Army to all kind of organizations like that because we have such a passion, and we've worked for a lot of big churches in the country. And it's
Mhm.
funny, we do a lot of documentaries. I just got back night before last from a week in Jordan in the Middle East. I'm leaving in 2 weeks for Australia. 2 weeks after that, we're going to India to film a documentary. So it's just an interesting thing as nonprofits are doing remarkable work all over the world, and we want to help them tell that story.
Well, I wanted to just in the last few minutes zero in on Museum of the Bible because I
Sure.
know you sort of went over that quickly because you've done a lot of big projects, but just for people, I think people listening in on this webinar and will watch it subsequently may have heard of Museum of the Bible, but maybe just talk about a
Sure.
bit of the scope of it and then also your role in it, because just so people know, okay, this is a pretty this is a large museum. Like, so just talk about what the Museum of the Bible is and your role in it in a bit more detail.
Well, it was founded by Steve Green, who's the president of Hobby Lobby. He's the chairman of the board of the Museum of the Bible, and he called maybe a year before they broke ground and asked us if we would help them with creating videos to document the museum, help with fundraising, marketing, awareness. And it's a remarkable thing. It's only 2 blocks from the Capitol building. It's possibly, it's a $1 billion museum. They spent more than 500 million on redoing the building, and then they spent another 500 million on the collection. So the collection is absolutely remarkable of artifacts related to the Bible throughout history. And they say it would take 2 weeks of 8-hour days to go through the entire collection, and you can see how extensive it is. But it's really quite remarkable when you see a Bible with Martin Luther's handwritten notes in the margin. It's amazing. They have everything from Martin Luther's Bible to Elvis Presley's Bible, so it's quite remarkable.
I,
But
I don't even want to ask which one gets viewed more often.
yeah,
Probably Elvis wins that one.
probably. Yeah, and it's got exhibits of how the Bible has impacted the entertainment industry, how it's impacted writing over the years, how it's impacted education, and so many other areas. And it's one of these things that's absolutely one of the most remarkable things I've ever been to. And I can't describe enough how amazing it is. And Steve had just a remarkable vision and was willing to put his money where his mouth is. And he's invested so much in it, and some other major donors came along and stood with him. And it's just, if you're ever in DC, like I say, it's 2 blocks from the Capitol. If you're ever in DC, I would encourage you to go visit the Museum of the Bible because it's absolutely breathtaking, and just the size, the scope, how professional it is. It's really quite remarkable.
Well, that's great. So just the last couple of minutes. So with the Museum of the Bible, from a marketing standpoint, what's like the key message they wanted to convey? Because it's interesting. Like, I'll just say, maybe I preface
Yeah,
it by saying, even though it's an evangelical family behind the museum, it's specifically Museum of the Bible, not the museum for the evangelization of everybody who
right.
comes there, right? So maybe just talk about that
Yeah,
nuance.
Steve has this theory that he wants to take a non-sectarian approach, which means it's not the Christian view of the Bible, it's not the Jewish view of the Bible, it's not the Catholic view or the Protestant view. It's the Bible. You come and experience what the Bible is all about, and that's the way they've put it out there. It's not designed, from any particular perspective. And that's why they have Jewish scholars that have come along and helped work there. They've had the Vatican has an exhibit there. And so it's really quite remarkable in the way they've done it. So it's not intended to have a certain perspective. Its goal is to just help people engage and encounter the Bible because Steve and others, and certainly I do, believe that when you engage with the Bible, it's going to have an impact on your life.
Well, and just an interesting question that I think would be relevant to everybody here is, so what was the pushback? Because I know, having just read
Yeah.
about it, of course, there's a fairly liberal media out there, and a lot of people who would be anti-Christians. Just talk briefly about the challenge of, say, communicating the message of the Museum of the Bible, because people would not necessarily be for the museum or
Yeah.
its message.
Well, when you consider there are thousands of biblical references in Shakespeare, the Bible is probably the predominant book that's quoted in literature of all kinds throughout history. It's impacted education. It was Christians that launched the hospital system, the university system. When you think about it, the Bible's had such a remarkable impact in the world that it's just funny that we don't teach the Bible in schools anymore. And whether you're not trying to get people to be a Christian, just understand the role the Bible has played in the development of history. And that's the ultimate message he wants to get out there. We've really forgotten what this remarkable book is all about and how much it's impacted our politics, our education, medicine, so many areas that we don't normally think about. But when you
Yeah.
go to the museum, you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, this book has had such an incredible impact on so
Mhm.
many areas of our culture that's important to stay up and understand that.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, thanks a lot for all your insights. I
I
feel like
love it.
we've packed a huge amount into 30 minutes. So thanks again, Phil.
Thank you.